Welcome to this webinar on planning and evaluating effective professional learning. Professional learning can lead to greater engagement, increased skill, and an environment that helps teachers want to stay. In other words, effective professional learning can increase student outcomes and lead to greater teacher retention. The 4 points below represent the through line for this session. We want to make sure that professional learning time is as valuable as possible. We want to understand that professional learning is a process. It should be job embedded and allow for continual growth. Want to understand that every teacher needs different things and that professional learning sessions should be built intentionally and with careful attention to session design. In this session, we will identify key elements of adult learning and how to evaluate the effectiveness of professional learning, as well as consider the key steps to planning a strong professional learning session. We'll reflect on how these sessions should be differentiated for new educators and receive tools to support the development of a professional learning session. We are going to be using a workbook throughout this session to reflect, analyze, and practice. If you have not yet downloaded the workbook that accompanies this webinar, please do so now. Whenever we ask you to use the workbook, please press pause on your webinar, complete the activity, and then come back. We're going to start by asking you to, in your workbook, reflect on your biggest challenges around professional learning. Pause, answer this question, and then return. Now, would love for you to take a second and pause and think about your goals for improving professional learning for this session. Please write those down in your workbook. With those in mind, we are going to move now to an overview of adult learning. To start, I'd like to ask you to read the 2 scenarios that are in your workbook and reflect on the differences in how these 2 sessions were planned and executed. Then, write down the major takeaways about adult learning that you draw from these scenarios. What are the principles that you're seeing play out in the way these 2 scenarios play out? This activity should take you about 10 minutes. Please press pause and take your time, read the scenarios and reflect on them, and come back when you're finished. We hope you found that interesting. Now we're going to talk through the principles of adult learning and apply them to the scenarios you just read. These principles of adult learning come from Malcolm Knowles. First, adults have input into the content. Adults know what they need. If adults come into sessions that include content that they've asked for or they're aware that they need, they are far more likely to be engaged. Learning is based on adults' lived experiences and knowledge. Adults have huge amounts of knowledge to bring to a room, and those should be in the center of the conversation rather than on the edge or dismissed. Adults learn best when they feel like the learning is something they can apply to their work immediately and that the learning will help them solve a problem they're currently facing. And finally, adult learning should be very focused on solving problems and not just merely listening to or memorizing content. As we apply these to the 2 scenarios, let's talk first about scenario 1. In scenario 1, we saw that the school leader discussed the challenges they observed with teachers, and the teachers asked for further support. We also saw in the actual scenario that the adults did the heavy lifting to understand the theory. They observed the videos and they came up with their own ideas. Adults also looked through a set of ideas to find the strategies that were most applicable to them. That's also a part of having immediate relevance and impact. They then use those strategies to make lesson plans that they could use in their classrooms. And they ended with commitments and next steps, which really demonstrated that the session was about problem solving rather than simply sending forward information. When we do the same exercise with scenario 2, we see that in scenario 2, the school leader based the activity on some conversations and observations, maybe not with a specificness, but he did use observations in thinking about it. In scenario 2, the school leader presented information rather than pulling from learner knowledge. The information was shared as more of a lecture format. The teachers in scenario 2 saw an example, but there was no time spent planning for use. And there were no commitments to change at the end. The session seemed more like a presentation rather than a chance to solve problems together. I think it's pretty clear how the difference in how the 2 were planned. And we'll get in a minute to what the impact of that was on the on students and on teacher practice. Most professional learning, unfortunately, looks more like scenario 2 and have the results of scenario 2. The new teacher project studied professional learning and found that despite a district spending an average of $18,000 per teacher per year, and teachers spending 10% of their time on development, less than 50% of teachers said the learning was tailored to their needs. Take a minute to reflect on this. Consider the latest professional learning session you attended. In your workbook, record how this session followed the principles of adult learning and where it diverged. Again, press pause and come back after you've had a chance to think. As we mentioned before, the next step in thinking about design is really to think about how we know it was successful. We're all used to quick surveys after sessions, but does that really tell us whether the learning led to a change in student outcomes or teacher practice? There are many systems out there for evaluation. Today, we're going to focus on Guskey. His 5 levels include: first, did participants like it? Second, did they learn what you wanted them to learn? Third, did the teachers have what they need to implement the strategy? This is getting at more of a structural change. Fourth, are participants using the new skill and knowledge? And finally, did we see any improvements in student learning? You can see how these levels go from a more experiential, did they like it, all the way down to what change did we see in student learning. Most surveys of professional learning stop at level 1. Occasionally they move to level 2. This slide here has a few data sources for each of these levels to consider, ranging from surveys to questionnaires, interviews, and student records. Please take a look at this for a minute. Now, look back at the last 2 scenarios and in your workbook, reflect on where you see them falling on these 5 levels. Let's start with scenario 2. In scenario 2, we didn't see any mention of surveys. Some teachers mentioned that they appreciated the session. There was an offer of help. That doesn't sound like something that's more of a fundamental support or change, but there is an offer there. We did not see any change in what the teachers did, and we didn't see any change in student struggle. Going back to scenario 1, however, we saw more changes. Under level 1, the teachers said they enjoyed the sessions in their surveys. In level 2, we were able to see that the lessons that the teachers developed looked good in the session. In level 3, we saw that there was a coach assigned to support teachers in the specific skill set, and that there was time set aside to really help with planning. Level 4, the principal went and did some walkthroughs and saw that there was some change in what teacher practice looked like. And by 3 months in, she could see a change in student outcomes. Consider the latest session you attended or led. Where did it fall on Guskey's levels? What data do you collect? And does it get to all 5 levels, or do you stop at 1 or 2? Take a minute to reflect in your workbook. I'd like to take another step back now and think about professional learning as a whole. A professional learning session, as we've been talking about, falls within the broader scope of a professional learning experience. 10% of professional learning are actual sessions like the ones we've talked about, or formal learning experiences. 20% of what adults learn is what we learn from each other through PLCs, through coaching, mentoring, working with other teachers. And 70% is what we learn on the job as a follow-up to a session, as a PLC, a coaching session, new tasks, or a day-to-day experience. All of these have a base in the Pennsylvania Professional Education Plan guidelines. Keeping this in mind helps us see all of this in a broader context. We call this the 70-20-10 rule, and it comes from the Center for Creative Leadership. Given that, and given that bigger picture point of view, what are the actual steps to building a strong professional learning session? First, we use data and input from teachers to decide where to focus. Second, we build focus goals and objectives that can be accomplished in the time you have. Third, we build meaningful activities that align with the adult learning principles above and ask for follow-up. We'll talk more about this in a minute. And fourth, we build in a structure to evaluate your professional learning. Living the learning is a strategy that Paul Bambrick Santoyo lays out in his book, Leverage Leadership. In order to build meaningful activities, you want to really think about ways that allow participants to reach the key ideas independently. For example, sharing the 2 videos and having participants compare to come up with the major themes. We would then want participants to really share their thoughts to help them come to the learning conclusions, and then allow the leader to assign formal and common language to the learning. After that, we ask participants to apply the learning to an existing problem and reflect on that application. We also make sure we end sessions with a clear follow-up action step to make sure we move into a job-embedded activity. In other words, by doing this process, we include both a formal session, learning from peers, and an action step that allows the work to be more job-embedded. In your workbook now, there is a blank template for building a professional development session. You can take, over the next few minutes, we're going to build a session together. You can take notes on that, or you can pick a topic and start to put in ideas for a session you have. Take a minute and read this description of a session, of the beginning of a session build. Reflect on what you think. You can see already how this leader is using adult learning principles. They're using data and input from teachers to decide where to focus. There's data from benchmarks, there's data from conversations, and that data is what's leading to the school leader making some decisions that we need to focus somewhere. The school leader then decides to focus on the following objectives. As they come up with objectives, you see a continued focus on relevance and impact. Then, as they build the system, they still make sure that as they build the session, they still make sure that the activity is based on adults' lived experiences and knowledge and has immediate relevance and impact. Here, they build an airtight activity in which they look at 3 lesson plans that use technology in some way. One really well, one mediocre, and one in which technology is really incidental. The facilitator asks very strong questions about these 3 lesson plans that really get to the outcome that the facilitator is looking for. There's some time to share, frame, apply, reflect, and have next steps. Finally, there's a structure for evaluating professional learning. And the structure for evaluating professional learning still comes back to the idea of immediate relevance and impact. New teachers sometimes need something different. For them, you might want to think about how to focus the content a little bit more. New teachers struggle with a lot, so you want to find bite-sized, high-impact areas. Remember also that a small shift can feel big to new teachers. Limit yourself to maybe 1 objective per session. Further, activities should be very concrete and provide lots of resources for the new teacher. They do have a lot of knowledge to go off of, but they should be tightly designed to ensure the lessons are crystal clear at the end. And finally, provide immediate support to new teachers in implementing the new ideas. You don't always need to separate new teachers from experienced teachers in a professional learning session, but make sure that you follow up with resources and specific ideas afterwards. In your workbook now, take a minute to think about ways you may adapt an existing session for new educators or brainstorm ideas for how to tap into knowledge and experience with new educators. In addition, take some time to pause and complete this document for a session you may be planning. We hope this information was helpful today. Here are some further articles and research you might reference. They're also listed in your workbook. If you have questions, contact information for Megan Steiner is right here. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a great day.